Good to see all of you who are here in the auditorium today, and I think we'll have a fair number of people watching streaming. So today we'll have a Bible class program in some parts of the building, but in this room we'll have the adults and talk about ourselves, how to assess one's self. You know, most people think they are fairly decent folks. They might have some rough edges here and there, but most people figure they're okay. So we'll start off today by looking at Mark chapter 10, verse 17 and following. Mark chapter 10, verse 17 and following. While you're turning over there, we do know that a fair number of people have been brought low with one malady or another. So we'll start off with a bit of prayer here as we begin our class. Holy Father in heaven, we're thankful for the believers in this congregation. We thank you, Father, for the encouragement we receive from each other. Thankful for the building that we're able to enjoy and for the opportunities to serve you in various roles. We're very aware of members who are ill and pray your blessings on all. Thankful, Father, for progress being made in understanding how to take care of some of the diseases that come our way. We pray your blessings on more progress and distribution of vaccines that will help people, and see the congregation having freedom to have more people present in the building. We are thankful forever for your sending Jesus, for your grace and love for us, your creatures. In Jesus' name, amen. Now back over to Mark chapter 10. Here's a fellow who thought he was just a pretty good guy, and from the description, I think we would think that's the case. Mark chapter 10, verse 17. Will, do you want to read that out there, or you have it open? Mark 10:17 through 22.
Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is, God. You know the commandments: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. He answered and said to him, Teacher, all these things I have done. Then Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said to him, One thing you lack, go your way, sell whatever you have, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Come, take up the cross and follow. But he was sad at this word and went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions.
Several things stand out on this, though we're not going to stay in this text very long. What was Jesus' response to the guy when he said he kept all those commandments? Go and sell. Okay, but I note the little passing phrase. How did yours read? He looked upon him and loved him. He loved him. Here's a fellow who was trying to do well. And I think a lot of people feel that way about themselves. A lot of people in the community would say, I try to keep the 10 Commandments. Isn't that right? And they try to be honorable, good citizens. And so Jesus loved this individual and pointed out something that he yet lacked. Now, a lesson is very simple. all of us can find some shortcomings somewhere in us. And so it was with this fellow, though he really excelled over many people of the time. You know, any of you ever been to marriage counseling? Ooh-wee, that's rough. Not that I have been there, but anyway, sometimes trying to help people, you know, be on that end. So a couple having trouble go to a marriage counselor, and the counselor will try to be objective, and he says, as he listens to the case, well, here is something that you can work on. Oftentimes, the individual who has something to work on will become inflamed. I'm done with this. I'm not going back to those sessions again. And that's it. That's the way it goes. Because a lot of times we think we're pretty good and we don't want to work on things that we can really address. That's kind of the nature of people. So today we could look at scriptures in like 1 Corinthians 7. There are verses there that pertain to single people. And you can say, well, I'm a married person, I'm no longer single, so I don't have to worry about those verses. Or on the other hand, we have single people in our congregation. You can read about counsel or advice, commands, and so forth given to married people. And so our brother over here can say, don't have to worry about that. I don't have a spouse. And we can go through the Bible that way, picking stuff out. How to rear your children. Mine are out of the nest. I don't have to worry about that anymore. Or other relationships. But let's look at a few verses, how to address ourselves, and think about self, about me. What do I need to do? First, let's note a human trait. We all like to point the fingers of blame at other people. That's been from the beginning. Who did it first? Back in Adam and Eve's time, right at the beginning. Adam blamed Eve for giving him the forbidden fruit, and she blamed the serpent. That's the cause. That's the cause. Have you ever heard of a judge coming to a settlement regarding an automobile wreck and lay 30% of the blame on this party and 70% of the blame on that party? So that happens sometimes. And so when there's a marriage conflict, there's an old preacher who used to say, there's his story, there's her story, then there's the truth. Everyone points the finger the other way, but sometimes neither party is objective. When a kid goes to school, there was a young fellow who's now grown up that was quite the hoot whenever he was little. He would do his homework and everything at the house, and then he'd march off to school and not even turn it in. His mother couldn't understand, what's the problem? And then there are others who would not do their work, and then they get to school and say, well, the dog ate the work, something like that, all the time making excuses. In my youth, I recollect preachers coming to our congregation. I think they might have stayed 2 years, maybe 3, and then they were gone. As a young fellow, I wondered, well, why'd they take off so fast? Did they run out of sermons? Did the church get tired of listening to the same boring guy week after week? Did the congregation think they needed a new preacher to take care of church problems that were really internal problems? What was the reason for the moving? Was a guy not paying his bills and he took off out of town to get away? I don't know. Or did the preacher step on too many toes? Now, sometimes I hop here and there in the Bible, but you've a familiarity with Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. I just want to reflect on what you have read over there many times. Jesus would write to the church at one town in Asia or another town, And there's a form that you see in each of those letters. To the angel of the church at, it might be Ephesus or Thyatira and so forth. These things saith he, and there's a description who the letter's from. And then he says, I know your works. Here's the pattern we see in each of these letters. Jesus will commend the church for some things they're doing. And then he'll say, I have this against you. You know all of that. But here's something that's easy to overlook. It seems like each of these letters starts off, to the angel of the church at so-and-so. Who's the angel? It's easy to slide right over that one, isn't it? Who is the angel of the church at so-and-so? Well, it's not described very fully, is it? What does the word angel mean? Yeah, it's the messenger. So we would, if we would kind of put it in our language, we'd get away from some kind of a angelic thought offhand and wonder, was it saying to the messenger of the church at Thyatira or Ephesus or wherever the letter was written? Now, if that's the case, were any of the messengers criticized? In Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3. I don't recall a single one, do you? Were any of the angels of the churches criticized? And what do you make of that? I don't see either a commendation or a rebuke. I suppose then that the Lord could adequately count on the messenger to convey his word to that church. But the messenger oftentimes is the one that gets hammered, doesn't he? Yes. It's not the messenger that's a problem. Yeah. So that very well-known verse back in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, people quote that all over in the community, it seems to me. Judge not that you be not judged. But that's the end of the quotation. The rest of the quotes, people generally don't remember, because number 2 verse, with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and what measure you meet, it shall be measured unto you. And there's more in the text that we would like to note. So here's where we're going. How can each of us improve ourselves, be better people, try to grow? A key deterrent restraining us from is to quickly not judge other people, but first of all, look at ourselves. That's what Jesus is driving at here. Now, there are a lot of four-way intersections around this town. I can think of some of them out near care centers for elderly people. You come to that four-way stop, everyone has a stop sign on his corner, and if you're a driver, what's your head going to be doing at that stop sign? It's going to be swiveling. You come to the stop sign, you're going to be looking here, you're going to be looking there, you're going to be looking over there, you're going to be seeing all the spots. What are the others doing? Who arrived here late or first and all that, and calculating who is the next one that should enter the intersection. Now, let's suppose you're at the intersection and you're going to make a right-hand turn. Yeah, we used to do this, didn't we? But we don't do that anymore. We just turn on the signal. Okay. You're going to do a right-hand turn. But if your head is swiveling this way, that way, and so forth, your inclination when you're doing a right-hand turn is to look which direction? Left. Because that's where you're going to get hammered. You don't want that one to get you. Now, I know an older woman in Utah who had no driver's license. She walked everywhere. She got hammered at least 2 times that I can recall by stepping off the curb over here on the right, because the driver was looking to the left. Here she steps off the curb and boom, knocked her down. She didn't get killed or anything. She just dusted off her britches and took off. Okay. So it's not always, everybody has to keep his eyes open. That's where this is going. All of us need to keep our eyes open because they've got an eager beaver over there. He got here late, but he's going to charge on out there anyway. That happens all the time, doesn't it? So if each person then will be careful himself, then it will help a whole lot. So that's my analogy. Take care to drive yourself first, and then oftentimes you can help prevent an accident, even though the other person is really out of place. I don't know why it's so hard to turn on a turn signal. I can put my little finger out, I think, on my steering wheel, boop, click it on or boop, down like that. But a lot of people just refuse to turn on the turn signal. And it seems like the bigger the beast is they drive, the less they turn them on to me in my smaller car. But if everyone uses those, it will help a lot. Because sometimes when we're moving from one lane to the other, we have a blind spot back there and we don't see clearly. But if we note by using the signals, somebody's coming over, he doesn't see me, well, then that helps prevent the accident. So look at oneself, be careful oneself, it'll cause a lot less problems. Now let's get into the Bible instead of the illustrations. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, King David was up on the roof. I suppose it's cooler up there with the houses they had back then. And he looks off in the distance and he sees Bathsheba over there bathing. You all know that story. Okay, now what might David use for excuses if he's not looking at himself? Good-looking woman over there. Why, she just threw herself at me. Well, he doesn't talk like that, does he? What did he do? I'll make it mild by saying he invited her over to his place. But he's not looking at his conduct himself. Whereas Joseph, down in Egypt, you know the account, Genesis chapter 39, Potiphar's wife had an eye for him, and we might talk about this later. Now, Joseph could say, what was I supposed to do? She threw herself at me. Is that what he did? What did Joseph do? He ran off. So he didn't make an excuse. He was not going to disappoint God, and he was not going to disappoint Potiphar, who was his boss, his owner, I guess you'd say, a master. But how can I do this? And he ran off. So now let's focus more closely in John chapter 21, verse 17 and following. After Jesus had been resurrected, raised from the grave, John 21, verse 17, he's talking to the Apostle Peter. Now he's gone at this is the third time where we'll pick up the reading. He says to him the third time, Simon, son of John, lovest thou me? I want you to note how Peter is reacting. Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, lovest thou me? Now let's think for just a moment. Why did Jesus hammer him 3 times? Do you love me? Why 3, do you think? What did Peter do whenever Jesus was on trial? 1, 2, 3, what? Denials. I'm wondering if that's the reason. 1, 2, 3. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Whatever. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep. And he then says, when you were young, you gird yourself and walk where you would, but when you shall be old, you shall stretch forth your hands, and another shall gird you and carry you where you would not. So Jesus is foreseeing what's going to happen to Peter, and he's telling Peter, this is what's going to happen when you get older. Okay, We're back in Peter's mindset. He's grieved. He keeps on asking me, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And he's already grieved at it. And now he's saying, this is what's going to happen to you when you get old. Peter just can't take it anymore. So what does he say? Verse 20, he turns about, he sees the disciple whom Jesus loved following, who leaned back on him on his breast at the supper. The one who asked, Lord, who is he that betrays thee? Peter, therefore, seeing him, says, Jesus, Lord, what shall this man do? Peter is tired of taking the heat. So what does he do? Point the finger at the other guy. What about him? Any of you reared children? Yeah. Have you ever seen your kiddos trying to get the heat off themselves by, what about, and point the finger? That's common. And so it is in the church. A regular preacher will get up here and he'll tell us a thing or two about our conduct. And what was the word we used earlier? The heads will start swiveling. Get him, preacher, get him. And it's easy to look at the other guy, isn't it? And sometimes we need to look at ourselves first. We probably should all the time. So Peter was squirming over what the Lord told him. But Jesus was not distracted whenever Peter tried to get the heat off himself. And he says to him, if I will that he tarry till I come, what does that tell you? Thee, follow thou me. In other words, stop being concerned about John. I think that's who Jesus is talking about there. Stop being concerned about him. You do what I'm telling you. Follow me. You love me, follow me. Feed my sheep and so forth. So we learn a lesson about ourselves. I think the expression is projecting. We project on other people. Have you ever seen politicians do that? I tell you what, I think the word that needs to be out there, hypocrites. A lot of times they are doing worse and they're picking on the other person. And it's so frustrating to watch that. After we come to church and we read things like this, how frustrating. So we need to be looking at ourselves and asking, am I just projecting this on others or can I improve? Now let's get down to where the application really is. How often people grump about sad conditions in this or that department in the church? Don't you hear it? Why isn't this person doing this? Why isn't this person doing that? Now let's ask ourselves, if we're going to look at ourselves first, do we who gripe admit to any shared responsibility about the matter? In other words, am I having any care? Am I helping with the responsibility myself? Or am I just picking on the other person? We don't like to talk about that. Or have I had a chat with a person who's having some difficulty? Giving them helpful information, perhaps, that they didn't know about. Or even in letting them know about past things that would help them understand why things go the way they do. I can't sit back and ream out that guy in that other department over there because he's ignorant if I haven't given any information to him that would enlighten him. Sometimes we need to help each other. Have I done anything to build him up, or do I just criticize the other guy? We need to look at ourselves. And the one that's really difficult, let's suppose everything turned about and I held the job myself and everybody sat around taking pot shots at me, not giving me a clue about anything, not giving me any help. How would I like that? So something to think about as we assess ourselves. Any observations here? Yes. Stay humble. Oh, now there's a sermon in itself. Thank you, Virginia. That's true. What's that old thing about the kids, that little story? Stuck into his thumb and pulled it a plum and said, what? What a good boy am I? You hear that old thing when children were read to as children, you know, from their parents, little children's stories? A lot of times we want to pat ourselves on the back, and so the point raised here is we need to be more humble.
Our ego.
Ego. Yes. What is ego? I guess we are proud. Is that part of it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move along then. The scripture says we need to honestly assess what talents and gifts we have that God gave us. Our text now is Romans chapter 12, in the reading there, that paragraph. Romans chapter 12, verse 3. I say through the grace that was given to me to every man that is among you. Here's the comment we just heard from Virginia back there. Not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now that's just what we heard out here in the audience, didn't we? Don't get so cocky and proud. Have some humility. Don't think higher of yourself than you ought to, but to think soberly according as God has dealt to each man a measure of faith. Now, I want to stop right there. There's a bunch more in the text, but let's stop right there for a moment and give thought to what Paul has just given us. If a person thinks more highly of himself than he ought, there are problems that will pop up. Sometimes church members make a mistake. They attempt to fill a position for which they are not ready or qualified. Oh, this might get a little bit sensitive from some of us, but have you ever seen an individual who is completely tone deaf lead the singing of a congregation? I visited another place one time. I was going to be the guest speaker, and I was all hyped up and ready to roll. And by the time the singing was over and I got to the pulpit, I was almost under the pew. It was so horrible. The singing just about killed me. I'm sorry, that was my emotional feeling. Maybe I shouldn't have been there, but that's how it got. Sometimes the person is not really the one who ought to be doing the job. Now, where the rubber hits the road is over in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Note what it has to say in the section about elders in verse 6. A person who is to be an overseer, not a novice. Now, what is a novice? The amateur, okay, a new convert, a new person, he's not matured yet. Not a novice. Why? Lest being puffed up, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Now, humility should be brought out again in that verse. He gets puffed up, and the devil snags him. Why? He's not suited to be in that position. And so, in the position, he becomes a person full of himself, and the devil will get him. And moves on in verse 7. He must have good testimony from them that are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. So if he is known in the community as some kind of a lowlife, rascal, no good, they will reproach him, and he will fall into the snare of the devil as these people begin to rattle about his conduct. So sometimes the person's not suitable for the job. And there's another one I'll put in here. When I was younger, there was a guy in the office of president who was known to be pretty blunt, Harry Truman. And I think he's credited with the saying, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Now, we're talking here in the context about those who would serve as overseers in the church. We've noted some of the problems that could, be present by people who are not ready for it. And sometimes the heat is too great. And if you can't stand the heat, Harry would say, get out of the kitchen. There are a lot of people, I don't think, want to get into the position of an elder in the church because it's too hot. Now, back in our text, we are noting in Romans chapter 12, God's given different gifts to people, different measures of faith, is the way Paul's putting it. We have many members in one body. All the members have not the same office. Now, folks, that's such a simple saying. We don't all have the same spot in the church, role of responsibility to fill. I know the gospel is to be taken by all of us into the world, but we are not all evangelists. And we make a mistake by calling everyone, or making the responsibility that was given to an evangelist, the responsibility of a young mother who has babies on both arms, that she's supposed to do the work of an evangelist. No, she's supposed to do the work of a mama. She's not that in that role. So we need to be careful. We have all the different members in the body, but they don't all have the same position or office, as he puts it in this version. Now, there's more on this. Let's see more about the individuals who have different roles, and then even get into individuals who have the same role. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. Church at Corinth had a lot of trouble. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 12 and 13. You've heard this lots of times. Well, you got that booming voice over there. How about reading 1 Corinthians 1, verse 12 through 13, please?
Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul?
If we went ahead and read the whole thing, look over in chapter 3, where Paul really extends this, where he says in verse 4, one says, I'm of Paul, another, I'm of Apollos. Are you not men? What then is Apollos? What's Paul? Ministers through whom you believed, each as the Lord gave to him. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So then neither is he that plants anything, neither is he that waters, but God gives the increase. Now he that plants and he that waters are one. Whoa, what'd you hear? Verse 8, third chapter. He that plants and he that waters are one. If we're listening to Paul, he's saying, it doesn't matter whether it's Paul or Apollos or Cephas, they're all on the same team. So we can have personalities that vary among qualified brethren, even individuals shouldering the same responsibilities in the church. Now, sometimes I hear people talking about, my favorite preacher is so-and-so. Okay, that's nice. But if we, in the state of Texas, for example, took a vote, who's the finest preacher in the land? And one person would say, I nominate so-and-so, I nominate another. And we begin to get contentious. What if your favorite preacher turns out to be third or fourth in the position, according to the thinking of the people in the state? Are you going to be disappointed? That's a bunch of foolishness. We're all on the same team. It doesn't matter whether this person has a different personality from that person. They're pulling on the same team. They're hooked up like they're in front of the old-time wagons and so forth, all bridled and hooked up together. One of them might be a little bit more muscular here, and the other might be a little bit lankier there. Who cares? They're on the same team. And we need to look at the church that way, if you ask me. I think it's scriptural. We are not vying and competing or jealous, any of that stuff. We ought to look at each other as team members. So he's the first string player. He's the second on the second string. Third, I don't care if he's the water boy. If they're all on the same team and they're pulling together, that's the way to do it. Let's look at 2 Corinthians as we look at the matter of Corinthians vying with each other over who is the important one, who is the great apostle, and all that kind of stuff. We're running out of time, so if you'll just peruse in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, we'll see that Paul apparently is being criticized by the Corinthians, or some people there. Verse 1, "Now I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, I who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am of good courage toward you, I beseech you that I may not, when present, show courage with a confidence wherewith I count to be bold against some who count of us as though we walked according to the flesh." Now, that's kind of in this version, a stumbling verse, the way it's put in English. But as he goes down through it, he brings out his behavior with the Corinthians in verse 9 and 10, as though he would terrify them by his letters. Verse 10, "His letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech of no account." I get the notion that some at Corinth said, "Paul, you can write some fine letters, but you're not worth a hoot when it comes to preaching. I don't like your speaking, the way you talk." That's the way it comes across. And some of them could say, "You remember Eutychus? Paul put him to sleep and he fell out the window, did. He hit the ground and died. Remember that? His preaching was so boring he couldn't take it anymore." I don't know, but that's the way people could look at Paul. Which is more important, an engaging preaching style or the writing style? I don't know. The point is, Paul was getting criticized for things like that, but these people who are criticizing him had not done near the work he had. So we went over another chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. "Let no man think me foolish, yet if you do, yet as foolish receive me, that I may glory a little." And if you look down through there, as I mentioned earlier, and peruse the next whopping paragraph, you'll see Paul went through this, that, and the other. Whether shipwrecked, being stoned to death, chased out of towns, he had a hard time of it. These people who are criticizing him, had they ever gone through all that? They had no business putting him down. They hadn't gone through all the stuff he'd gone through. Night and day in the deep and all the rest that's named over here, beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, cold, perils of countrymen and robbers and all that kind of stuff that's named. One thing after another. But they sit back and they pick on him. Well, some of us like to watch sports. Let's suppose there's an NFL football game on a Sunday. Well, we like to sit back and watch where the players goofed. And we become, what do they call them? Monday morning expert quarterbacks or something, people criticizing what's going on, something like that. Let's suppose we have a business meeting. The men are trying to figure out the budget for the year. I have a saying, when it comes to spending church money, everyone is an expert. And it's amusing getting those business meetings and listen to the way the guys carry on. The guy who's in perpetual indebtedness, he's an expert. The guy who keeps buying things that don't work and throwing them out and buying another one, he's an expert. The guy who has nothing in the bank account and he's getting to be old, he's an expert. He should have saved a little, it seems like. Everybody's an expert. And so that is the way we get in the church. Sometimes we're all experts about everybody else's business. We need to be careful and have some humility. So Romans chapter 12, we're about to run out of time here in verse 6. Having gifts differing according to the grace that was given to us, whether prophecy, let us prophesy according to the proportion of our faith. Someone says, Ron, that sounds like a miraculous gift. That's fine. Or ministry, let us give ourselves to ministry. He that teaches to teaching. Some people are teachers. He that exhorts to his exhorting. There are some people in the church who have the ability to boost people. There's an old fellow I used to be so happy to meet in Washington State when we lived up there. I was a young preacher, and he always had something nice to say to give me a little encouragement about my sermon. I can even give you his name, a remarkable man. Or he that gives, do it with liberality. Some people are in a position to give because they got money. Others are in a position where, well, I need some money, I'm about to starve. So there's a difference. Didn't one of our preachers the other day say in our recent meeting, there are some people who are able to give, and there are others who need to be given to. Something along those lines. If I put it the way he put it, it'd been a little smoother. So we have seen a little bit today about how to assess ourselves. One last thought, we got to quit. In Acts chapter 6, apostles were still in place at Jerusalem. In the first few verses, the Grecian widows, you see, were being neglected. And so there was murmuring going on. Who had control of the church in Acts chapter 6 at the beginning? The apostles, the inspired men, the disciples of Jesus. Things were messed up in their administration. Those Grecian widows were getting gypped. The apostles perceived, we can't take care of all the business, right? And so, church, get together and find the 7 men, and so forth, who can take care of this business. We need to give ourselves over to the ministry, the study, the Word of God, and prayer. They had other things they were supposed to be focusing on. They couldn't get distracted with that. So it is in the church. Assess your gift, what you have, find where you can excel, and get about that business. You don't need to be doing the other guy's business or criticizing each other. We're all on the same team. We're out of time. Any thought before they come through the door? Thank you.